I belonged with them, Aaron's story. My name is Aaron Vale, and I was 23 years old when my life finally changed. Before that, my world had always been gray. I grew up in a house that never truly felt like home. My parents were both betas and lived with traditional beliefs, and because I was different, because I was an Omega, they treated me like a mistake they never wanted. They never hated me loudly, that would have hurt less. Instead, they ignored me quietly. I learned very early that silence could hurt more than shouting. I studied hard because books became my escape and education became my promise to myself that one day I would leave. Years later, I stood in front of Sterling Foundations for an interview. The Sterling triplets owned half of South Extension and were known as untouchable CEOs. Cale Sterling, warm and confident. Lucien Sterling, blonde and endlessly rational. Ronan Sterling, scar-faced and quiet, head of security. The moment I walked in, all four of us froze. I couldn't explain it. Something felt familiar. Safe. Like my heart had recognized something before my mind could. I got hired immediately, and the weeks that followed confused me. Working with them never felt like working. It felt like coming home somewhere I had never lived. Cale constantly smiled and checked if I had eaten. Lucien remembered tiny details I forgot myself. Ronan silently stood nearby whenever meetings became crowded. Slowly I noticed something else. Whenever I walked around the office, their scents always lingered around me protectively, almost like invisible shields. Other dominant personalities stopped crowding me or standing too close. I noticed it. I understood it. And strangely, I allowed it. Because for the first time in my life, I felt safe. They never forced closeness. They never crossed boundaries. But every morning there was my favorite sandwich on my desk, pastries beside paperwork, coffee prepared exactly how I liked it. Sometimes I caught them looking. Sometimes I caught them looking at me with expressions so soft that my chest hurt. I felt attached too, but I was scared of wanting too much. Meanwhile, Thomas Holdings hated Sterling Foundations. Their CEO, Victor Thomas, had lost nearly everything competing against them. The newspapers talked about lawsuits and losses. Desperate people made desperate decisions. I didn't know that while I organized schedules and attended meetings, people had begun watching me. One evening after work, my car never reached home. Hands grabbed me from behind. Darkness covered my face. The world disappeared. Days blurred together after that. I couldn't see anything. I sat in a cold room with barely any food and water. I heard footsteps and voices around me. I felt trapped and terrified. Worst of all, I felt unsafe. Men stood around me constantly and I hated it. I wanted Cale's reassuring laugh, Lucien's calm voice, Ronan's silent presence nearby. I remembered every little thing. Cale bringing pastries back. Letting me to rest. Ronan placing his coat over my shoulders without speaking. During one visit, Victor Thomas approached and touched my shoulder in a way that immediately made me move away. I pushed him and resisted. Fear filled me. He laughed cruelly and said the Sterling brothers had finally lost something precious. I felt disgusted and helpless, but I kept thinking of them. Somehow remembering them kept me strong. Later I learned what happened outside those walls. The Sterling triplets had completely fallen apart. They searched the city day and night. They used money, influence, connections, everything. They stopped sleeping. Stopped eating. Cale blamed himself. Lucien stopped speaking unless absolutely necessary. Ronan apparently destroyed 3 rooms during his rage. 5 days later I heard explosions and shouting. Heavy footsteps. Screams. Suddenly light flooded the room. Arms wrapped around me immediately. Familiar warmth. Familiar comfort. Familiar safety. I heard Cale's shaking. I heard Cale's shaking voice say my name. Ronan held me so tightly I thought he was afraid I would disappear. Lucien touched my face carefully like he was making sure I was real. Then Cale whispered through tears, "We're sorry. We're so sorry we were late." And for the first time, I cried. They wrapped blankets around me and surrounded me with comfort. I didn't want them leaving my side. I held Cale's sleeve and whispered, "Please don't go." Cale kissed my forehead and smiled sadly. "We have to finish this." Ronan's eyes looked frighteningly cold while Lucien quietly promised me they would return. At the mansion the butler welcomed me gently and helped me settle in. I showered and tried sleeping, but I couldn't. Hours later they finally returned after handling everything. Cleaned up, exhausted, and still looking terrified. They brought my favorite food. We sat together quietly and ate. Then Cale suddenly looked at me and whispered, "I love you." Lucien looked down and admitted he had loved me from the beginning. Ronan simply held my hand and said, "Home is wherever you are." I cried harder than I ever had. Because nobody had ever chosen me before. The next morning I already knew my answer. I belonged with them. A week later our ceremony happened. Small. Beautiful. Warm. No crowds. No pressure. Only people who genuinely loved us. My parents weren't there, and honestly, for once, that didn't hurt. I stood beside Cale, Lucien, and Ronan and looked around at the family I had somehow found. During my speech I couldn't stop crying. I thanked them for teaching me that family wasn't blood. Family was choosing each other every day. Afterwards we laughed, danced, ate desserts, and Cale held me while Ronan silently stood nearby and Lucien fixed every tiny detail like always. That night I fell asleep happier than I had ever been. 3 months later life felt unreal. We ate breakfast together every morning and dinners together every evening. We watched movies, traveled, laughed. One day while they were away working, I felt strange and decided to visit the hospital. I expected stress. Nothing more. But after tests, the doctor smiled softly and showed me ultrasound pictures. Then she told me there wasn't one baby. There were 3. Triplets. I stared at the screen and cried quietly. Not from sadness. Never sadness. I sat there touching my stomach while tears rolled down my face because for the first time in my life, I realized I had built my own family. Mine. Ours. Afterwards I went shopping. I bought 3 tiny pairs of shoes and boxed them carefully. At home I placed 3 boxes on the dining table with letters saying, "Open me." When they arrived home, confusion quickly became shock. Inside were tiny shoes and ultrasound photos. I stood behind them crying and whispered, "We're having babies." Cale immediately started crying. Lucien stared silently before tears appeared. Ronan simply turned around and hugged me so tightly I couldn't breathe. For 9 months they spoiled me endlessly. Cravings at 3 in the morning? They drove across the city searching for strawberry cake. Morning sickness? They stayed beside me. Bad dreams? They held me until I slept again. They read parenting books and argued over names and panicked over every tiny thing. 9 months later I went into labor. All 3 stayed beside me the entire time. They held my hands and reassured me over and over that I wasn't alone. Hours later crying filled the room. 3 daughters. 3 tiny girls. Cale held one and immediately cried. Lucien looked absolutely speechless holding another. Ronan stared at the 3rd baby with tears falling silently down his face. I looked at all of them and suddenly remembered that lonely little boy I used to be. The one nobody wanted. I wished I could tell him to wait. Just wait a little longer. Because one day he would find people who loved him enough to search entire cities for him, people who would become home. Looking at my